Hello, and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. I am Maha Nassar, non-resident fellow at the Foundation for Middle East Peace and an associate professor in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona. Today is September 21st, 2022, and I am delighted to be here with Basil Farraj. Basil received his doctorate in anthropology and sociology from the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. He is also a policy analyst at Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. Basil's research centers on the Israeli prison system, the impact of Israeli torture and violence on Palestinian prisoners, and the ways in which prisons have come to reflect the broader colonial reality under which Palestinians live. 1 year ago this month, 6 Palestinian political prisoners escaped from the Israeli high-security Gilboa or Gilboa prison near the city of Nazareth. Over the course of several months, the prisoners dug a tunnel from underneath their cell floor, through the prison grounds, and out to the outside world. Escaping on foot, they eluded a full-scale manhunt for nearly 2 weeks. Though they were eventually recaptured, Palestinians hailed them as the heroes of the Freedom Tunnel. The prisoner issue is a central one for Palestinians, especially those living under Israeli occupation. Yet it tends not to receive as much attention in the West. Basil's groundbreaking research on Palestinian prisoners, coupled with his own experiences as a child visiting his father in prison, make him an ideal guest to discuss this topic. So Basil, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Ma. Thanks to you.
So let's start with some basic definitions. In our discussion today, we'll be talking a lot about Israel's, quote, carceral policies, unquote, and about Israel as a, quote, carceral regime, unquote. So can you please share with our listeners what scholars mean when they use the term carceral?
Yes, so thanks again, Maha, for inviting me. I'm sure lots of the listeners now have already heard the term carceral state, particularly perhaps in the context of the US, where you have mass industrial imprisonment industrial complex. Activity that the populations have been subjected to in various parts of the world. So the term itself comes from Latin, from the term carcer, which means to imprison or to captivate. However, in academic discourse and academic work, the term has kind of evolved. It does not particularly solely refer to imprisonment as in the physical space of the prison itself, but it also means and refers to the condition of surveillance, of captivity, of monitoring, and of course of the physical imprisonment itself. However, I think that's what's unique about this term is that it refers to a condition under which populations live. So, for example, if we talk about Palestine, we are talking about not only the impact the Israeli prison regime has had on the Palestinian population since Israel's violent inception, but also on the ways in which Israel has been trying to deal with the Palestinian population. So we talk about the checkpoints, the monitoring that exists around the checkpoints, around the settlements, around the wall, the ways in which Palestinians have to apply for permits to be able to leave, to enter. So in a way, and just to reiterate what myself at least mean when I refer to Israel as a carceral state is not only the mechanisms of punishment that Israel employs inside its multiple prisons, but it's also the way it deals or treats the occupied population as a subject for monitoring, for constant surveillance, and for punishment. And I think actually just to give the listeners other forms of carcerality, you could think of also electronic surveillance, for example. You could think of monitoring the cell phones of people, which Israel has also been employing. So in a way, it's a very broad term to describe the condition under which subjugated populations live. And in Palestine, I think it's very visible and very clear the way Israel has been employing these tactics of surveillance to punish and to detain and to constantly have the Palestinian fully aware that they are being monitored. I think that's what I refer to the term by using this term.
Thank you. So it's not just the physical imprisonment, but it's all the apparatuses that surround that in terms of surveillance, in terms of monitoring. And I think a really important point that you just mentioned that I think eludes a lot of people is that Palestinians are constantly aware that they're constantly being surveilled and watched and ready and sort of always on the lookout for Israel to punish them whenever they, anytime.
And maybe just to add on that, actually, and that's why lots of scholars have also, and of course activists, have referred to Israel as to Gaza, and that also is part of the carceral tactics that Israel has been employing, confining that population into a small strip of land, controlling what comes in, what comes out, and who can enter and who can leave as well. So in a way that expands the metaphor, and it's also constantly used by Palestinian prisoners themselves, that we have in Palestine, we have a small prison and a large prison. The small prison refers to the physical site where people get imprisoned, so the jails themselves. And then the large prison is the reality of the occupied territories and the 1948 areas and the Gaza Strip, of course, where Israel has been employing this carceral tactics to control the Palestinian population.
Yeah, it gives new meaning to what we hear Palestinians referring to the occupied territories and especially Gaza as a large prison, as a large open-air prison. So it's not just the physical confinement, but it's all the mechanisms of control that go with that. Absolutely, thank you. So you recently wrote a piece in Shabaka about Israel's use of administrative detention, and we'll post that article in the show notes. So can you please tell our listeners and viewers, what is administrative detention? What are its origins? And how does it fit into Israel's carceral regime?
Yeah, so administrative detention is a practice by the Israeli security threat to the Israeli state. So that's kind of the overarching umbrella of the detention, which is.
Sorry to interrupt you. You froze, and so I'll ask them to cut this part out. But I'm going to repeat the question,
yes,
and then you can start answering because we missed the key definition there. Okay, Basil, you recently wrote in Shabaka about Israel's use of administrative detention, which we'll post in the show notes. Can you please tell us what is administrative detention, what are its origins, and how does it fit into Israel's carceral regime?
Yeah, so before I address particularly what administrative detention means, I have to say that the Israeli judicial system, in particular, the military law where Palestinians get prosecuted, it functions on the premise of security, of maintaining security, of maintaining public order. So in a way to understand administrative detention, which is a policy and practice that allows Israel to detain any Palestinian at any given time without subjecting them to trial or to persecution, under the premise that the individual poses a threat to Israel's security and public order. But I mentioned security and public order before, just to kind of foreground. Of a security threat to allow its judicial and army branches to arrest and detain any Palestinian without serving and providing any justification. So what happens is that the military commander the head of the military army, the military division in the West Bank, can issue a detention order against a Palestinian, just simply saying that this individual poses a threat to Israel's security, which allows the Israeli state to detain them for an unspecified duration of time. So this can be from 6 months, 4 months, or 3 months, but it's constantly permissible to renew this detention order. So it's very arbitrary. It can be applied against any Palestinian if the Israeli state or judicial system believes that they pose a threat. There's never a justification for the reasons of arrest. So actually, in my work, when I investigate, kind of researched and they always say that, in the military courts, that we cannot share this information. It's present with us, but it's in the file, but it's secret file, that we cannot share it because sharing it with subject might pose a threat to Israel's security. So again, this policy is completely arbitrary, and just to kind of historicize its use, it has been used before Israel's existence. So before Israel came to existence, of course, through violence in 1948, the British colonial mandate over Palestine had issued its own defense regulations in 1945, which allowed it to arbitrarily detain any Palestinian at any given time, citing similar concerns, which is, security, maintaining public order, and also to further contextualize its use. I have to mention that this practice is used worldwide, of course. I mean, you for example, our listeners might recall that the British colonial power also has used this in Northern Ireland, for example. It was a practice vastly used detention, but only in particular and specific circumstances that really pose a threat to the security of the state. But Israel has been using this practice, as I have been mentioning arbitrarily. It has a criminalizing nature to its use, where it constantly portrays the Palestinian as a potential threat to be. So when for example, when the prosecutor or the military or the security agency, the Shabak, claim that the individual Palestinian presents a threat to the security of Israel without providing justifications or evidence, they are concretely fortifying this notion that the Palestinian subject is a threat to the Israeli state. And I think maybe we might go into this later on, but the entire military court system functions on this premise that the Palestinian as a subject already racialized by the Israeli state as an inferior subject, of course, vis-a-vis the Israeli Jewish settlers, that this subject constantly presents a threat. So if we want to understand its use currently, has been using this policy relentlessly, and that's why Palestinians have been trying to kind of resist this practice. But I think the core and this also explains why Palestinians have been resisting this, is that it leaves them in a state of kind of constant waiting. You never know when you will be released. You never know why you have been arrested in the first place. And of course, you can imagine what happens to the family itself, to the children, if the person is, is married, if he or she are married. So it really also has a psychological impact on the Palestinian population, I think. And it's one of the core, and just maybe to finalize, I think administrative detention is one of the central policies that Israel uses within its carceral system to kind of instill fear also, because in reality, and just to kind of to stress this point again, any Palestinian is subject to this policy. Any Palestinian can be detained at any given time, and you would never know the duration of this arrest.
Thank you. So really, it's a lot of it has to do with the arbitrariness and the unknownness. So administrative detention can happen at any time. You will not necessarily know the reason why you're being administratively detained for any period of time that can continue for any duration of time, and the families never know what's happening either. So that's administrative detention, but there are Palestinian political prisoners, what Palestinians refer to as political prisoners, Israelis refer to them as security prisoners, who are in Israeli jails. So according to Ad-Damir, the Prisoners Support and Human Rights Association, today there are about 4,650 Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli jails. About 750 or so of them are administrative detainees, but of the total, about 3,700 of them are adult male prisoners who presumably have gone through a court trial and have been convicted in Israeli military court. So almost all Palestinians consider their imprisonment to also be unjust, even though technically they went through a trial. So can you please tell us a little bit about the Israeli military court system and why Palestinians view it as inherently unjust and unfair?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, and particularly since we were discussing administrative detention. So one point, and I'll go through this, as I speak. But when we say that administrative detention, for example, is unfair, it's unjust, because you do not provide evidence, you do not really subject the detention. If we want to understand what the Israeli legal system, we have to first take note that there are two laws that function in the West Bank, in the occupied territory. So the first one is the civil law that's subject to Israeli settlers who reside in the same territory as the Palestinians, so settlers who live in the West Bank now currently. And the second is the military law that Israel has established upon its occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967. So there's already a differential treatment between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians. Now military law, now if we go to the second layer, which is the military courts, the military courts were established in 1967 following a military order that established military courts on the third day, I think, of the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Now, the military court is specifically deals, the ones I'm talking about, specifically deal with Palestinian population. So Palestinian residents of the West Bank are trialed in military courts. Palestinian residents of Palestinians differentially, but also to treat Palestinians as a whole different from Israeli settlers. Now, why do Palestinians view this as unfair? First of all, Israel has been constantly, since its inception, has been using torture and violence in its detention of Palestinians. So when we hear, if we want to kind of understand, if we listen kind of without understanding the context to a military court, you might see the same things that you would see in television. So you would see a prosecutor, you would see the transcribers, you would see the judges. Of course, the judges sit on a dais, in front of the detainees and their families. So when you enter military courts, you might have this sense of, okay, maybe something is happening here. This is a court. It might be a fair trial. But in reality, Israel extracts confessions from Palestinians through torture and violence. They deny them their rights through the transportations upon detention. Ad-Damir, for example, has constantly documented violations of Palestinians upon their arrest and through their interrogation. Israel utilizes brutal means of interrogation. Share during the interrogation as a tool against them. So in a way, that's one of the facets in which the Israeli military court system is unfair, is that it gives precedence to confessions or confessions extracted through torture and violence. That's one aspect of this. The second and most important aspect is that the Israeli military court system itself functions on the basis of military law. Now, as I have mentioned previously in my previous answers to administrative detention, military law itself and the military orders that Israel has issued over the years is already views Palestinians as inherently inferior, as inherently dangerous to the Israeli state. So you have a similar notions being thrown in the military orders, the thousands of orders that Israel has published, where they depict where you have the terms such as security, maintaining public order. And to kind of hone in this point, I want to share with you one of the military orders that Israel uses currently to try Palestinians. It's military order number 1651. It was issued in 2009. Now, this military order is an extensive document. It's nearly example. It discusses what happens if a Palestinian throws a stone at an Israeli jeep, at Israeli soldiers, and it explains the maximum years of sentencing that each offense, they refer to it as offenses, would entail. Now, this same document, when you read it, you can understand how the Israeli state and its military persecution, its military courts, and of course the military order itself already views Palestinians as I have been mentioning, as inherently inferior, as a potential threat to the Israeli state. So, for example, one of the sections of the military order states that if a Palestinian is caught waving a flag or affixing a flag, they might be persecuted and punished and sentenced for 10 years of imprisonment. So you can see that these military courts, despite kind of the attempt to portray them as fair, as just, they really serve a political purpose. And I think that's where the core issue with military courts is that it belongs to an occupying regime, so it can never be it can never provide a fair trial to the Palestinians. That's the first part. And second, that it treats Palestinians as subjects that deserve punishment. And maybe we have the time later on to discuss kind of the military order and how it functions, but that's the sense you would get if you go as a visitor to military courts. You would see how the spatial arrangement itself of the military court portrays this kind of power and racial difference, where the Palestinian is placed behind this cage, where the soldiers are present. It's a military court, of course. You can imagine soldiers are there. They're not, the common civil judges and prosecutors. And again, I think I want to kind of reiterate this point again, that and it has already been said by multiple Palestinian prisoners, these courts serve a political function, which is to suppress the Palestinian resistance, to kind of distort the collective will of the Palestinian political movement, to portray Palestinians, as you have mentioned, Maha, as terrorists instead of as political prisoners. And by the way, Israel has never accepted this categorization. It does not treat Palestinians as prisoners of war or as political prisoners. As you have been mentioning, they do treat them, and this is encoded also in the Israeli Prison Services documents, they treat them as security prisoners. So once again, we have this notion of security that Israel constantly tries to kind of portray and to reinforce through its laws, through its military orders. Maha, I disconnected. I was sorry about that.
I think I'm going to
So yes, just to reiterate that why Palestinians view military courts as unfair and unjust, in addition to the harassment that they receive in interrogation centers and the admissibility of confessions taken through force and torture. I think it's also because these courts serve a political purpose. And numerous political prisoners have been mentioning this, that the Israeli state's functions, that the courts themselves are theatrical, and that they serve to dissuade Palestinians from resisting the occupation and to depict them as terrorists who deserve their punishment. While in reality, I think the entire Israeli judicial system plays a part in the occupation of the Palestinian people. And that's how we should view it, and that's how we should treat it.
Right. So I think it's really important to underscore what you just said there, which is that the military court system for Palestinians doesn't exist as a neutral arbiter. It exists as part of the carceral regime of surveillance, of punishment, and of trying to dissuade Palestinians from any sort of political expression under the cover of security. So there is no presumption of innocence. There is no, jury of your peers. There's nothing like that at all. So every element of the military court system is part of the military occupation apparatus. So when we hear a conviction rate in military court system of 99.7%, for example, it's precisely for that reason. Palestinians don't get to see the evidence against them. They don't get to be tried in front of a jury of their peers, and there is no presumption of innocence. So that's really, so even those convictions, they're called security prisoners by the Israelis, but the Palestinians really see them as political prisoners. So thank you for that. So just to remind you, I'm Maha Nassar, and I'm here with Basil Farraj talking about Israel's prison system and the experiences of Palestinian prisoners and their families. So let's turn to that last part about Palestinian prisoners and their families. So your research is focused on Palestinian political prisoners and administrative detainees, but the prisoner issue is also a very personal one for you. Your father, Abdulrazak Farraj, has spent a total of over 19 years in Israeli prisons under multiple periods of administrative detention. You've written some really moving essays about what it was like for you growing up while your father was in prison, and we'll post these in the show notes as well. Can you please give our listeners a glimpse into what life was like for you as the son of a Palestinian political prisoner?
Well, I think perhaps I would say that it's the absence of the father figure that was perhaps the most difficult when I was growing up. I think as common, you've already mentioned the statistics, but as common with thousands of families in Palestine, I think having one or two of the family members absent, whether it be the father, the mother, the brother, the sister, it already kind of just creates a severe impact on the family itself. As a child, myself as a child, of course, growing up, I had numerous doubts, questions of why was my father arrested, and particularly because he was under administrative detention, it was even more difficult to understand why would this, why would he tell me that he might be released on this particular date, and suddenly we would receive kind of an extension, a detention renewal order of yet another 6 months. So you can imagine what would happen to a child, awaiting for the news, having a specific date set in his mind that his father or mother would be released, and suddenly you'd have this, that you'd have to wait yet another 6 months for the potential, for the thought of being, of having your father with you. But I think more generally, I think it does indeed have an impact on Palestinian families. And this is not to romanticize what does it mean to have an absent, figure, family figure, or to kind of overburden it with emotions. But I think the Israeli occupation also plays that card, where a missing person of the family is also an attempt to teach a lesson to other Palestinians that this might be your fate if and when you dare to resist the occupation. And I think, and that's how we understand, or that's how we might understand how the Israeli occupation treats Palestinian children when they arrest them, right? And when they arrest their fathers, and the way they arrest people from their houses. I think the psychological impact has already been addressed by multiple people in Palestine. And I definitely think that this should be addressed even more. But I think it might be, and I can imagine this now, but it might be very difficult to explain to a child living in Palestine why why is this, why is my father not released once the detention order is terminated, once it's over. But then I think, of course, growing up for myself as a Palestinian, you understand that this is part of the occupation and how it functions, and that so I hope I answered the question in some way or another.
I think you did. I think the unknowing, that sort of living in a constant state of unknowing, and then when administrative detention orders are renewed multiple times, there's a sense of not being able to have hope, to have a future. So if you think your father's going to be released on this date in time to celebrate your birthday, for example, but then that renewal order is issued and then they miss your birthday or what have you. I think as a child, just having that security of being able to plan in the future gets robbed from you. And I think that's one of the things when you say that the administrative detention system is not just about the detainees, but about their families as well. I think that's a crucial element of that. And I think it also speaks to the arbitrariness and also the pervasiveness of the occupation. When we say occupation, when Palestinians say occupation, I think a lot of people don't necessarily understand how much it messes with people's lives. It's not just checkpoints, it's not just detention, but it's all the elements of time and planning and future and family that affects every single person under occupation.
Exactly.
So your father's latest arrest was in September of 2019. According to Abdelmir, he has been subjected to multiple forms of physical and psychological torture. We'll post a link to Abdelmir's report in the show notes, so I won't ask you to describe the torture he endured. But would you mind sharing with us your father's current condition?
Yeah, so he's still awaiting trial. He's in trial and awaiting sentencing. He's been undergoing the trial in military court in Ofer, which is in the vicinity of Ramallah city, for the past 3 years. So we are still waiting, for kind of determination of the trial period and hoping for the best for the sentencing part. Hoping that we would welcome him very soon to the house.
Inshallah. So I mentioned Abdelmir's report of your father's treatment. Abdelmir, just to remind our listeners and viewers, is also one of the 7 organizations, one of the 7 Palestinian NGOs that Israel recently ordered to be shut down. So looking at the larger picture, how does Israel's use of administrative detention and its shutting down of Palestinian NGOs work together to repress Palestinians?
Yeah, so I think they function, both mechanisms, so the shutting down of organizations and administrative detention, function under the logic of criminalizing any social and activist work that Palestinians carry out in Palestine. I think particularly with the organizations that have been shut down, there has been also a political purpose. These organizations, such as Abdelmir, have been exposing Israel's violations. They have been documenting what Israel has been doing for prisoners in Gaza, and the West Bank, for children in particular, for one of the other organizations. So you would see, you could understand their logic is to shut down and to force shut maybe the work and the voice of Palestinians who are forcefully raising their voice against the occupation, and also galvanizing and kind of gathering public opinion internationally against Israeli practices. So, and I think, the first one, administrative detention, is an attempt to kind of lock in people. And I think the shutting down of organizations is also an attempt to lock out, the image, the voice of the Palestinian people that these organizations have been doing for many years. And also Israel has been doing this under very similar pretexts, by the way. So the justification for closing these organizations is very similar to what they use for administrative detention. So it's security, protecting public order. It's a similar logic, and this might also have the listeners understand a bit more how the notion of security is well entrenched in Israeli practice and in discourse, and how it actually feeds on these kind of racial and violent practices of the Israeli state, where any voice against Israel, whether it doesn't have to be political also, it can be social, So it's a criminalization of Palestinian livelihood, I think, and of the attempt of Palestinians to resist in various ways the Israeli occupation. It's worth mentioning that Israel also does subject activists to administrative detention, and we can also see this as a full circle. So it's not only these organizations, also activists who are arrested and in the attempt to suppress their voice and suppress their work.
Yeah. So when we think about Israel as a carceral regime, that full circle, I think, is a good analogy. So it's locking people in through administrative detention, locking people out so international observers can't see what's happening, locking up individual activists and individuals who may raise their voice, and then shutting down the organizations that try to bring attention and bring awareness to those people who are raising their voices. So it's a total attempt to keep all Palestinian political, social, cultural expression down, while at the same time ensuring or trying to ensure that others aren't aware of that suppression. Okay. So during his years of administrative detention, your father has launched several hunger strikes to protest his imprisonment without charge or trial. Late last month, Khalil Awauda also secured a promise to be released from administrative detention after he had launched a grueling 6-month-long hunger strike. And just a few weeks ago, on September 1st, the Palestinian prisoners' movement announced a victory after the Israeli prison administration agreed to several of their demands for more humane treatment in order to avert a mass open-ended hunger strike that they had called. So what role do you think hunger strikes play in the Palestinian prisoner movement? And why would the Israeli prison administration fear a mass open-ended hunger strike?
Yeah, so for the first question, hunger strikes have been used by Palestinian prisoners over the years. It has constantly emerged as one of the last resort of demanding their rights from the Israeli carceral authorities, so the IPS, the Israeli Prison Service. Why do they use them? It's because I think, and here we can there's different analysis, but it's the last resort. So when Israel continues to violate prisoners' rights, when they take away their right to books, to education, when they constantly use administrative detention as an easy way out, as an easy policy, then Palestinian and we've seen this over the past years, and they resort to this as a last tactic. But it has, I think, in my analysis at least, it has its own power. Why does Israel fear it? And particularly, they do not. I think they particularly fear a mass open-ended hunger strike as the one you have mentioned. It's because they have been trying over the past years, and particularly perhaps since the signing of the Oslo Accords, to kind of dismantle the Palestinian political movement. So in the past, the Palestinian political movement was perhaps more unified. It was a collective movement. Israel, as it has been doing outside prisons, they have been trying to kind of dismantle the unity of the Palestinian movement. So any action that emerges in a unified fashion, so for example, the way prisoners have responded to the heroic escape of the 6 prisoners, for example, as the recent call for a mass hunger strike. Israel fears these tactics, which it affirms primarily the political nature of the Palestinian prisoners, so the political nature of their imprisonment, and I think more simply it asserts to the power that a unified movement can have. Over the past, in the 60s and 70s, Israel would specifically fear a unified mass hunger strike, because it knew that when the prisoners unify, they can really exert their demands. So I think in the what you have been mentioning, and by the way, there's talk of a potential hunger strike by 30 administrative detainees by the end of this month as well. But the emergence of a mass unified hunger strike is a political expression also of unity. and it scares Israel because it can achieve more demands, I think, and more rights. And Israel again has been trying to dismantle the political movement, the prisoners movement over the past years. And I think once this emerges, it's an assertion that Israel's attempt has not been fully complete.
Yeah. I think it's important also to reiterate that the Palestinian political prisoner movement has a great deal of political capital in Palestinian society as a whole, in part because they seem to transcend the political rivalries between, for example, Fatah and Hamas and so forth. And so they have a kind of moral authority among a lot of in Palestinian society more broadly, which is also something that I think Israel fears. Is that a fair statement, you think?
I think so too. Yeah, I think so. And the prisoners movement has also had, over the years, their own role in Palestinian political affairs as well, because of, as you said, because of their status, and that's why a collective move by the prisoners is really very powerful. And this has happened in the past, and I think it has happened in recent years as well.
Okay. Thank you for that. So you mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, Israel confiscating books, banning books, and so forth. In an essay that you wrote for the Institute for Palestine Studies, you wrote about other forms of prisoner resistance, particularly writing and pursuing university education. And we'll post that essay as well. You called your piece Define Carcerality. Can you please tell us a bit about why writing and education in particular are so central for Palestinian prisoners, and how the Israeli regime tries to suppress their cultural pursuits?
Yeah, so in a similar fashion, I'll try to contextualize first, what does it mean to have writing culture productions inside prisons? So prior to the 1990s, the Palestinian prisoners did not have adequate access to books and pens and paper, and they had only managed to secure their rights through hunger strikes. So this also links to the previous question. However, over the recent years, Israel has been trying to kind of control the Palestinian prisoners' education system, to restrict the number of books that are allowed to prison. Currently, for example, in Offer prison, you're only allowed to, and under certain circumstances, to bring in 2 books for each prisoner, and you have to ask for permission before the Israeli prison service subjects the books for inspection. So there's lots of an attempt to control what enters the prison. But why is it important? It's because I think I think it's also, this has been constant for the prisoners movement, that the prisons have been referred to as a school, as a university. There's lots of political educational sessions that take place inside prisons. The political parties themselves try to teach the prisoners, try to have collaborative discussion groups, reading groups as well. But why does Israel, and here I want to read a quote from the Supreme Court of Israel. So in 2011, the Israeli authorities declared that Palestinian prisoners would no longer be able to pursue their higher education at the Open University in Israel. So Adala, which is a Palestinian human rights organization, petitioned against the Supreme Court's decision. So the court stated in its ruling, and I quote here, that higher education is not a right for people classified as security prisoners. And yet in another petition, the Supreme Court reiterated its position by arguing, and I quote, higher education funding for prisoners is from terrorist organizations and aims to strengthen their positions within the prisons. So Israel views education as as a right to non-security prisoners. And since Israel views Palestinians as security prisoners, they view this kind of, it's a privilege in a way that they do not deserve. And I think that's why Palestinian prisoners have been trying constantly to smuggle their writings outside prisons. So there's no easy way of sharing what prisoners write except for smuggling, for example. Prisoners have been constantly writing, publishing novels, poems, scholarly work, And in my own research as well, I treat Palestinian prisoners as scholars, as academics, because they are. They have been conceptually providing us with concepts to understand Israeli occupation, but they have been doing this creatively, and that's what I did in my text. I discuss how despite Israel's attempt to restrict what enters prisons, despite their attempt to restrict the number of books, to kind of minimize that interaction between prisoners and the outside world, prisoners have been able to kind of devise novel means to share their knowledge with us on the outside, to kind of continue that status and to reinforce it of prisons as universities. And I think you would hear this in Palestine a lot. When Palestinian prisoners leave prisons, they discuss this kind of collective aspect of the educational system of the prison itself, and how it does teach. It's an educational institution, I think. And I think that's, to go back to your question at the beginning, that's why they fear the Israelis, that educational system as well, because it does reinforce ideas. It raises, strengthens the notion of the collective inside prison as well, and strengthens the political nature of the political imprisonment, I think.
Thank you for that. It strikes me as there's an irony, which is that these carceral policies of administrative detention and imprisonment in the military court system is to try to stamp out Palestinian political consciousness. And yet it seems to have the opposite effect of reinforcing and deepening Palestinian political consciousness, both among the prisoners as well as Palestinians outside of it. And so it also speaks to the dead end of the Israeli carceral policies here, that there's no end game that you can see. And yet obviously Israel continues to employ these practices. So what can we do? So in your piece in Shabaka, you call on the International Palestine Solidarity community to work to end, in part, one of the things that you call for in terms of your policy recommendations is for international Palestine solidarity groups to work to end the exchange programs between Israeli and US law enforcement agencies, like those highlighted in the Deadly Exchange campaign. And we'll link to that campaign in the show notes. So you've mentioned earlier that the use of prisons and imprisonment to target specific populations, subjugated populations, is not unique to the Palestinian case. So how do you see your research helping other groups of people who are targeted by carceral regimes around the world?
I think Israel has kind of managed to create a status for itself as kind of the ultimate security state, the ultimate surveillance state. I think Israel, as you have already noted, it exports its knowledge to other parts of the world. It has not only been training, having mutual security programs with the United States, but also in Latin America, for example, where it has been doing, violent work, teaching the armies and police of multiple nations how to suppress populations. So I think, in a way, and that's my argument in my work as well, if we understand the Israeli carceral regime, we might be able to understand and see what might occur in other parts of the world. Israel is trying to, and perhaps our listeners know this, but it has been trying to fortify that its status as an arm exporter, as a security knowledge exporter, global exporter, and one of this knowledge is the carceral knowledge, the ways to confine populations. And here I'm again to remind our listeners that we're talking about the broader tactics of surveillance and punishment. So Israel exports its knowledge to multiple parts of the world, and I think one of those, as I said, one of this knowledge is how to better surveil and confine and punish populations. And I think what happens in Palestine, unfortunately, if we do not work against the Israeli occupation and work towards an end to this apartheid regime, might occur in other places as well. And I think in that way, my research also examines the possibilities for resisting these carceral regimes. I think we might not have addressed this too much in our discussion today, but the other part of the carceral regime is people's and prisoners' attempts to kind of constantly confront what occurs inside prisons and inside carceral settings. And I think we can build upon this to better confront, the violence, the racialization that occurs in multiple parts of the world, including Palestine, the United States, and Latin America. And I think if we address the Israeli, the Palestinian issue, and by issue I mean the occupation and the apartheid, we might be able to also secure futures in other parts of the world as well. In order to stop Israel from becoming, from exporting its knowledge and from continuing to export its knowledge to other parts of the world.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that in many ways, Israel is a harbinger for possibilities of other, like the greater emergence of carceral regimes in other parts of the world. And so part of what we're doing in terms of resisting against it and drawing attention to it and supporting Palestinian resistance to the Israeli carceral regime is to hopefully try to prevent or mitigate the export of these carceral regimes and policies of surveillance and confinement to other peoples around the world. So with that, thank you so much, Basil Farraj, for sharing your time and analysis today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, www.fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast and lots of other great content related to Palestine and Israel. And please make sure you are subscribed to this podcast to stay up to date. You can find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, or Spotify. And you can watch video versions of our podcasts, including this one, on YouTube. And with that, I am Maha Nassar, signing off until the next episode of FMEP's Occupied Thoughts.